the energy, industries ever get off with that.
Welcome everyone to Melbourne Connect and to the late afternoon panel session at Melbourne Connect Innovation Week. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past and present. We live, work and explore on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and we recognise their continuous connection to this land and acknowledge our First Nations people as our first scientists, engineers and innovators in this place. Thank you to the Melbourne Connect leadership team for their vision and dedication to the partnership between the university, businesses and the community. Today's panel will examine the future of offshore wind in Australia and to the technology, people and infrastructure driving offshore energy innovation. As some of you may know, Australia's offshore wind future is fast approaching. With it comes a unique opportunity to deliver clean energy at scale, backed by digital innovation, policy momentum and infrastructure planning. But getting there will take more than just turbines in the water. It will require new ways of working, stronger alignment across sectors, and the smart integration of people, platforms, and technology. In this panel, industry leaders, academic experts, and infrastructure innovators come together to explore how technology and collaboration are transforming offshore wind delivery. We'll unpack how digital trends are enabling smarter decision-making and greater certainty in complex offshore environments. My name is William Burrows. I'm the Senior Delivery Manager with InEight. I'm excited to be joined by our highly experienced and varied panel from the Australian Centre of Offshore Wind Energy, as well as Bardex, InEight leaders in project controls technology and leaders in the transmission and renewables energy development right here in Victoria. Before we get started, I want to know that we'll take questions at the end, so if you can hold any questions you might have to the last minute and we'll find some time to go through those. Now I'll introduce our panellists for today. We have Xiaohei Chow, Associate Professor at the University of Melbourne and Director of the Australian Centre for Offshore Wind Energy. Andrew Harris, Senior Vice President, Sales and Operations for InEight, APAC and Japan. Richard McAllister, Director at Bardex. And Deepak Sharma, Director of Project Delivery at VicGrid. Okay, let's get started. Deepak, I might start with you if I can. I want to talk a bit about why offshore energy, what role does it play in the clean energy power generation into the future in Australia?
Yeah, no, thank you, and good morning everyone, or good afternoon should I say, and I also want to pay my respects to the elders, traditional owners before I start. So, in terms of the energy transition, can you hear me all right? As we all know, we are, the coal, I think we all, this is one of the questions that have always been asked, like the why, and the simple answer is we have the coal plants that are aging and they're going to retire. In addition to that, the Victorian government has got some really strong targets. So we're looking at 60% renewable by 2030 and around 90%, 95% by 2035. And that's where the transition needs to occur. So we need to replace that aging coal with renewable infrastructure, and onshore and offshore wind and solar plays quite a significant role. If you haven't already, I'll highly encourage you. We released our first 15-year strategic plan called the Victorian Transmission Plan, VTP 2025, that was released a couple of weeks ago, that outlines the transition strategy over the next 15 years, and offshore plays a significant part of that. The government last year, I believe, legislated the target, so we're looking at 2 gigawatts by 2032, 4 gigawatts by 2035 and 9 gigawatts by 2040. And just to kind of give you a bit of some numbers here. So by 2040, as we transition and all coal retires by then, approximately 30% of our energy mix will come from, or the energy will come from the offshore sector. That's quite a significant amount, as you can see, from what our ambitions are. So to conclude, really, it's we are transitioning from coal to renewables, and offshore has a significant role to play in that.
Excellent. And look, as you said, the targets, 2 gigawatts by 2035 and ultimately 9 gigawatts by 2040. They're sort of fairly big targets. How do we balance, Richard, throw over to you, how do we balance that sort of the delivery and urgency around delivery? I mean, getting started, not only then working through those targets. What's the right way to balance that urgency with a sustainable delivery methodology?
Good question. Look, a bit of background from my perspective. We're a US firm that's entered the Australian market in the port infrastructure space. And I guess part of my role was to determine where our focus should be from a business perspective, where we should invest in setting up our manufacturing, our infrastructure, and it became glaringly apparent after a year that Australia's port infrastructure in particular is, I'd say, woefully inadequate in this space. That's not just for wind, but we also look at maritime sustainment and the offshore oil and gas decommissioning. So, in terms of our view of the world, we're already well and truly lagging in terms of getting ready for offshore wind in terms of infrastructure offshore. When you think about how many gigawatts, if we want 2 gigawatts by 2032, I think that's roughly 130, 140, 200 metre tall towers with underwater infrastructure, cabling, all that kind of stuff. It's a very, very large industry in that sense from an infrastructure perspective. So we're lagging in that sense, and having spent a good half of my life in government strategic policy, I guess, I'm used to seeing knee-jerk reactions to things done at kind of the last minute, and we end up meeting the target potentially, but we do it in a very rushed fashion, which is not sustainable when you're talking about creating future industries. So what I see as a really important piece is having some good strategic policy, but also good de-risking by governments and others, be that investment or be that setting up the right environment, to ensure that we not just focus on one industry or in particular one proponent, that we actually look at the broader picture, because we're trying to facilitate a whole industry. We're not just trying to facilitate one proponent in particular. And in facilitating a whole industry, what other industries are there that we should be facilitating? And now is almost too late to be making that decision. I wish it had happened 5 years ago in that sense. But if you do that in the right way, and if we get moving in that, it's a much more sustainable model for future industries, because it's not just offshore wind that needs to do heavy infrastructure. The oil and gas industry still need to operate, but also need to bring their infrastructure in. Now that's all very heavy metal, recycling, decommissioning and whatnot. And at the same time, we've got a naval build-up that's very large, in the billions and billions of dollars. Where does that position itself in terms of ongoing sustainment? We're great at, well, I wouldn't even say great, but we're happy to purchase assets and build them, but there's been no thought put into the overall maintenance of these things in long term. So I see a number of crossover industries where we really need some serious policy and strategic support. And if we don't do it, we'll just end up with what I call kind of bespoke ports, bespoke outcomes that are fit for only one target, one industry. And that's not sustainable. It's not sustainable for jobs. It's not sustainable for logistics. It's not sustainable for supply.
Yeah. And Xiaohei, we've touched on a lot there, from port infrastructure to the logistics of delivering. What else should our audience today, engineers, students, sort of understand about the future, and what sort of roles are involved in making this a sustainable practice long term?
So I think I would just like to add on what Deepak said first. I think we need to recognize about the scale of Australian offshore wind development. So if you take a look at Australia, currently we have 6 offshore wind zones being declared, with Gippsland being the first one. If you use Gippsland offshore wind farm as an example, the declared area is about 15,000 kilometers square. Correct me if I'm wrong. And if you take a look at the largest wind farm in Europe at this moment, it's just 500 kilometers square. So it is this scale that is not seen elsewhere in the world that has attracted 37 feasibility license application out of which about 12 projects were awarded. I mean licensed, not project yet. And this really present an exciting opportunities for this new sector in Australia. Now, another skill I would like to talk about is in terms of time. Now, Deepak has mentioned that we have a Victorian offshore wind target of 2 gigawatts by 2032. That is about 7 years from now. So I would like to talk about the typical lifespan of offshore wind farm. We're talking about a 40 years proposition from planning, installation and construction, operation and maintenance to decommissioning. So just imagine this scale plus 40 years. So this means, we need to develop the workforce. This means enormous job. And it's not just the industry that get excited, the research community is getting excited as well. So exciting opportunities is all I could say.
Yeah. I like the way you've outlined the scale of it. I mean, it is enormous. Both onshore and offshore. Speaking about the just delivery of offshore wind projects, what are the factors that make offshore wind unique? Xiaowei, I might leave that one with you if that's okay. So within that sort of scale, what is it that makes that offshore wind such a, we don't just take onshore wind turbines and put them in the ocean.
Yep.
There's obviously a bit more to it than that.
Yep. So I guess offshore wind is not new. It's very matured in Europe and also in certain apex region. In Australia, I don't think we can just copy and paste because we do face some unique challenges. If you talk to our social scientists, they will still say, much work needs to be done in terms of community engagement. And I suspect we're going to get to that later when we have a chance to discuss. Now, if you take a look in terms of logistics, which is as mentioned by Richard, port and supply chain, given how remote Australia is one of the biggest issues. Now, we also have engineering challenges. So in Australia, we have a very problematic seabed that is easily crushable. This is in fact my expertise, so this is why I'm getting really excited about it. But putting that engineering challenge aside, we also have our unique marine environment. So Australia has one of the richest biodiversity in the world, and our marine species may respond differently to that in Europe. So there's a lot of work that need to be done to address all these unique challenges that is not seen elsewhere. And we really need to have our local expertise and capabilities to tackle that while working collaboratively and learning from overseas experience.
And Richard, just going back to logistics, I mean, you mentioned the scale of the ocean, the actual area that this takes up, the logistics around just the towers themselves and the infrastructure that needs to go in place. I mean, the scale associated with just manufacturing, logistics to site and installation, I mean, it becomes a very unique problem to solve at scale and in the timeframes involved.
Yeah, it is to an extent, but I also believe that we're not new in this space. In that oil and gas has been doing this for 60 years. They've been offshoring very large assets, and essentially it's a similar situation. Now there may be different boats that are required to go and install the various things, but this is not new technology in that sense. And I was just down at, interestingly enough, down at Barry Beach, down in Corner Inlet yesterday, and they're very much, well, this is business as usual. We'll switch from our 60-year, 40-year program of oil and gas offshoring and now onshoring, because they're bringing it all back in a decommissioning sense. For them, it's just more big stuff that needs to go offshore. So the logistics side, I think, it's not that big a challenge. I think we can recognise that we actually have a lot of expertise in that space in Australia. It's just getting that expertise engaged. And one of the surprising things I found was even talking to the decommissioning guys, the oil and gas decommissioning guys, they're very kind of blinkered in their, I wouldn't say in their view, but in their focus. And when I talk to them about, well, you guys are going to need ports to bring this stuff into, have you spoken to the wind industry about, similarities in that space? And they're very much, oh no, it's very hard for us in the oil and gas space to link into that. There seems to be a bit of a barrier. So I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned, a lot of opportunity there. We don't need to reinvent the wheel as much as I think we do need to.
Yeah, yeah.
But there will need to be a greater focus from government and the like to have these regions set up. Barry Beach, for instance, Southern Gippsland. When I look at it, and I live down there, it's a beautiful part of the world. But the roads down there, the supply lines, the logistics, it's very, it's in dire need of upgrade. I'll safely say they're probably not.
Yep.
So that's the areas that really need to be linked up in a logistics sense, and as a priority, because if they're not there for the commencement of installation at 2030, which is not that far away, and O&M by 2032, we're really just delaying the industry further.
I think just Bill, one of the things that Richard just touched on, that the industry itself, not just energy, but the construction industry itself suffers from uniqueness bias. And I really think that we run the risk of missing, to your point, a lot of the inherent knowledge that sits in existing sectors to do big things and to do big things on tight timelines where you need that collaboration. And I think, that's not unique to wind, because at the same time that we're looking at an offshore wind industry, we're also decommissioning a coal industry at the same time. We're not just creating something new, we're also turning something old off as well. So the mechanics of that become really large, and the ability to facilitate collaboration across the stakeholders, I think, is one of the greatest opportunities that we've got, because we've got inherent knowledge of doing things in the ocean and its impact, existing infrastructure, and I think it's around how do we accelerate some of that, which I'm sure we'll get into with Deepak and Xiaowei around policy. 2 years ago I was at a green energy conference where the CEO of the Port of Newcastle was talking about being able to land the assets but not being able to get them out of the port. But nothing's changed in any ports in Australia yet, so I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to accelerate the known risks and opportunities as well.
Yeah. We'll come back to a bit, perhaps the parties that need to collaborate a bit, but staying with you, Andrew, around sort of your experience with digital platforms, connected data, and how that sort of helps with collaboration, particularly on these asset delivery through to operation and maintenance at this sort of scale as well.
There's a huge opportunity, talking to Xiaowei before, being able to bring all the stakeholders together into a secure environment, I think is really important, and the platforms are there today. I think to Richard's point around, high-grade internet with things like Starlink or, where's NBN in this picture to drive, high-grade connectivity, because one of the greatest opportunities, I think, for speed is access to data. And if you can reuse the data time and time again, learn from every turbine or every access point, and repeat those schedules, because as you talked about, the acceleration from our first 2 gigawatts to our 9, what are we doubling the capacity and reducing the time by 50%, in each window. There's a huge crunch in that. And I think, being able to provide the right data to the field teams, to the engineers, always on, is going to be a massive part of it, to help reduce costs, but also, hit the delivery timeframes as well. I think there's an open-mindedness that we all need to bring to the table. We've got multiple government agencies, we've got multiple private sector organisations involved. And if I use a stat from a conference a couple of weeks ago in a different industry, but there's 9 government agencies involved in one transport and main roads project in Queensland. So, which means you need multiple stakeholders from 9 agencies to make a decision. As an industry, we've got to find a way to drop that down, because I think we're at risk of paralysing ourselves to get to where we need to be.
And that's a great segue back to collaboration. And I think, Richard, that sort of oil and gas meets wind use of port facilities and is a great example of where getting different stakeholders using the same facilities in the same timeframes and facilitating that kind of collaboration. Obviously, there's further collaboration from government through the private sector. What's the best way to sort of, how do we bring this together, and what's happening current state around that sort of collaboration?
Oh gosh, I've got lots of ideas about how to bring it together. And I just pitched this yesterday to DECA and others. Particularly in Victoria, I do wonder where's the place for something like an Office of the Coordinator General or someone to take charge of what is. I think one of the things to me that seems to be missing is that people don't appreciate how large this is. If we were starting any other energy business that produced 9 gigawatts, that's essentially all the coal-fired power stations that were ever put into Victoria and other places. You know, we used to do that on a government scale, and it would have been coordinated centrally in that sense. That's missing now.
Yeah.
And with the wind industry in particular, I just don't see, everywhere I enter in terms of talking to government and others, I don't see the focus on the scale, really. I mean, there are parts that clearly understand it, but at the higher level, I don't think there's a full appreciation of the scale of it and the implications if it doesn't go ahead. Because if we fail, particularly if we fail at this first hurdle of Star of the South, and community, industry get cold feet on it, what's the next step for energy in Victoria? We don't really have a next step. So that then results in greater power prices, more blackouts, all those sorts of things occur, which becomes a major crisis for government. So to me, that really scales to needing a central coordination, regardless of who the parties are. In terms of the private sector, I think if the conditions are right, the oil and gas industry will pivot to that new part, or at least the construction side of it. But again, I'll use an example. I've visited some of the major steel manufacturers in the Latrobe Valley, for instance, the ones that used to, or still to an extent, repair and fix all the large generation systems. Very large scale fabrication. Majority of the work they now do is for Northwest Shelf and other, from Victoria, because they need that business. Now, when I talk to them about what does the opportunities look like for you in offshore wind, you know, who's coordinating that? They're like, we really haven't been engaged in that space. And to me, that's a lost opportunity. That who guides that? And I think that's really a centralised function of government to be able to pull that together and guide that, because without it, those kind of industries, a lot of those are ageing, they're going to lose their staff. Trying to recreate those again is a difficult thing. We may as well use them while they're there. Yeah.
And Deepak, is that something you've seen through the Victorian Transmission Plan and community engagement in those areas where, perhaps the coal-fired power stations are being shut down? Is that a key part of your consultation and community engagement?
Absolutely. And look, there's some really, really good points, and I just wanted to provide, I know there are lots of students here, some comfort to you that, it's not all doomsday, it's not all bad. So, so I'll pick a couple of points and to give some examples of how we are actually working to address those. So you talk about uniqueness bias, and I've been in the energy sector for 15 years, and I absolutely agree. Every industry sometimes can be in that siloed kind of mentality. The way we are, at VicGrid, and in the energy sector are trying to kind of break some of those barriers, bringing in a lot of people from transport, from those major build projects. Because, the last time we actually built big 500 kilovolt transmission lines was decades ago. So we haven't got those skills in the energy sector, and we don't want to make mistakes that others have learned from. So there's a lot of leveraging that we are doing from that sector. So hopefully we'll break some of that uniqueness bias. We talked about collaboration and coordination, and again, I'll highly encourage you, if you haven't had a chance to look at it, the Victorian government for the offshore wind periodically releases what we call an implementation statement. So we are now on implementation statement number 4. I was just saying that I think that the first one was released in October 2022, and the last one was in April 2025. And we have been providing some kind of signals in those implementation statements around a lot of these things we discussed today, like, what's our port strategy, what's our transmission strategy, how do we collaborate with the traditional owners, how do we collaborate with the local industry, how do we ensure that local jobs, and skills are developed. So, the government has something called a local jobs first policy and a local jobs first framework. So I think in the last implementation statement, it kind of sent a very clear signal to the participants in that were participating in the ROI or expression of interest process that minimum 80% local content during the operations and maintenance phase, which is spread over 30 years. There's a major project skills guarantee which requires 10% of all labor hours to be performed by apprentices, trainees, and cadets. So these are now some very clear requirements that we have included, from the proponents. Coming back to the communities and stakeholders, like I was just sharing with Xiaowei, we released a draft Victorian transmission plan on 16th of May. It was a 6 weeks of consultation. I think I did over 4,000 kilometers of travel across the state to talk to various stakeholders, and probably the most rewarding part of my career to date, because you just, I was in kitchen tables with the farmers having a cup of tea to community sessions where you really heard about what it means and some of the perceived risks that communities have and how we could actually address that. I think if you were to ask me, and a lot of engineers in this room, a lot of technical people in this room, I think solving for that crushed seabed, we will come up with a solution. I think solving for how we stand those towers would be easy. I think it's getting the social license, getting that buy-in from the community, that genuine partnership with our First Nations people is really, I think, what our defining legacy would be. When we kind of do this transition, and there are challenges, but I see them as opportunities. I see them as opportunities in terms of how this is a once-in-a-generation transition.
Yeah.
How we actually now use this transition to benefit, people who are going to be impacted. So if I'm a landholder that is hosting transmission towers that I know doesn't really power my home, it's kind of a bit of a social thing. It's kind of powering Melbourne and kind of the whole of the Victoria. What is it in it for me? It's really things like those that we really have an opportunity to get it right. Have we got it right yet? No, we haven't. I think there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of listening for the state to do. And an example of that, again, just to make sure we're not just doomsaying this, there's some good things that are happening as well. So, we talked about all those license holders in Gippsland. They all obviously want to connect to the grid because, you need to power or transfer your electrons. And, the distance from the shoreline res in Gippsland to the transmission network is circa 50, 60 kilometers. Now imagine if you are a landholder and you got 15 developers knocking on your door and saying, I've got a great deal for you. Here's kind of a transmission line that we want to build. And they're saying, I've got no time. And I'm just getting, you think about your local councils, you think about your traditional owners, they are getting inundated by all these different developers. And what the state said in its first implementation statement in October 2022, that VIGRID will coordinate the transmission. And, voila, all of a sudden, instead of getting 15 phone calls, now you're getting everything coordinated by one agency who is now talking to the landholders, talking to the traditional owners, talking to and coordinating this with all the developers. And you always go to that one agency, which is Vigrid, to kind of find out about what's happening with the transmission network in that state. So I think really we are trying to come up with a lot of processes, a lot of systems, a lot of ideas, and I think I'm very excited about this.
Yeah, awesome. And Xiaowei, I might just go to you and say, in your role around sort of advocating for offshore wind and so forth, and perhaps collaboration at more of between the government and industry, I suppose. Just your thoughts on the forums that are required and what sort of work's needed in that area as well.
Yep. I think I'm just going to come back to what Richard said about coordination. I think this gets mentioned a lot. To me, coordination is the key. We need to bring all the offshore wind key stakeholders together on the table and find out the best way forward. Now, I'm not saying we don't have that. Currently, there are some effort. So for instance, you can see the Gippsland license holder come together forming the OG12. We also have, various working groups from department. Now, in this conversation so far, we hear a lot of how government are interacting with industry and developers. But what is not being mentioned a lot is how the research or the university sector can play a part. If you take a look at how offshore wind industry has evolved, taking Europe as an example, from the first offshore wind farm with less than 1 megawatts turbine to now of 16 megawatts turbine. And that innovation is only possible because of research. And you can see a lot of big research center overseas. For instance, you see the Catapult or the ORE in the UK that's being funded by the government, and also we have some co-investment that enable this progress. So I think it's important to recognize that we also need the research or the university sector to play an important role in this transition. And I also like to mention that this is why we established the center, where our vision is to try to become a portal for key stakeholders to assess research and training capabilities. Now, on that note, another thing I would like to bring out is we have been talking about silos, and that is not what we want to be. It is the same in terms of research as well. So we see to tackle or to support this offshore wind sector, we have to take a multidisciplinary approach. Now, I would like to give you an example. So recently, our social scientists and our marine ecologists, they come together and release a report on how to enable decision-making in offshore wind. This is a report commissioned by the Australian Marine Conservation Society. This is just one example of how a multidisciplinary cooperation or collaboration could work together. Now, and lastly, I want to point out two calls. I think the first is we need to explore a long-term and sustainable funding mechanism to try to crack the knowledge gap of the highest priorities. And that is across different horizons, immediate, intermediate, and long-term. There will be different needs. And I think the second call would be, I think Andrew talks about data. We need to have a proper data infrastructure where, for instance, developer can deposit data, researcher can deposit their data. If you take a look in the UK, we have the Marine Exchange Database. That is just one such example that we could have in Australia. So I think I will stop here.
Oh, no, that's okay. And look, my next question, I actually wanted to stay with you around the changing workforce as well, because obviously there's when we talk about skills and the kind of skills required to actually support, I guess not only construction, but that operation and through life support of these, what is a new industry in this part of the world. What's needed in leading into that skill, developing those skills and skills development and transitioning a workforce from perhaps the coal-fired power stations through to offshore wind?
So I think we have to tackle this across all levels. So we have to start from the young generation. And this is why we have to do outreach activities. So I'm just going to give you an example. So at the University of Melbourne, we have established a student team called Victoria Offshore Wind. So our students conduct a beach demo, installing model offshore wind turbine, engage with families during summer months in local beach. So this is just one such example of how we encourage the young one to gain exposure about the industry. And this event sometimes is sponsored by industry as well, because you mentioned can we work with industry about that. Now, progressing upwards, we also need to recognize that in terms of workforce, there's vocational. So for instance, you need the electrician to kind of maintain the offshore wind turbine. But you also need the very high end, which is the research that I spoke about earlier, to enable innovation. So currently, if you take a look at various initiatives by Australian government, we have PhD scheme that involve industry, where we get our students to co-locate with industry partners. It could be, developers. In fact, I was just speaking to Andrew earlier about such scheme, on how you can help to enable and position Australia as the preferred offshore wind market. So this is across all levels. Yep.
And I think it's positioning Australia, but then I think if we're selfish about it, we also want to position Victoria as the leading state as well. I think, other states are going to, strive for similar energy transition goals. So we're not only competing on a global level, but I think we're competing on an interstate level as well. So I think as we accelerate, it's an opportunity to promote Victoria. And going back to Deepak's point, there is so much opportunity that this transition brings to every industry that it touches, that I think it's something to be excited about. Yes, we have to worry about certain things, but it's something to be excited about. There's an opportunity for everyone to play a fantastic part in achieving that goal.
And Deepak, again, that local engagement in the communities that are directly sort of impacted around this, I suppose that's a key part of that engagement as well, is looking at the opportunity that's ahead as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. And look, again, just how we might do this differently is, 15, 20 years ago, I guess, when you would do projects, you would do a stakeholder management plan as a bit of an afterthought. But now you actually have an opportunity to engage them to co-design, your projects. So, using the offshore wind as specific examples and transmission networks that we are looking to build, it's really, again, where we have done differently to how we have done in the past is, in engineering terminology, we used to call it design and defend. You design something, you draw a line, you do your easements, then you go and defend, and people say, you're not consulting, you're actually telling us. Whereas now we are saying, here's an area of interest. Let's work with you and say, where's the best place to put. So we're not shirking away from the need that, it is required. We're not saying there's a world that we can live without transmission lines. They are needed. But how do we best work, with the communities and with the stakeholders to ensure that, we got the right solution. And look, end of the day, we are also very pragmatic that, we're not going to police everyone, but, it's really ensuring that, rather than me and my team or, others trying to advocate for it, if we get the communities and the traditional owners and others advocating for this change, that's kind of a win-win for everyone. So it's quite an important piece.
Awesome. I might just throw a few general questions out there, if I can. If there's one misconception or myth that you think's around about the transition or wind energy, what would you think that is, and what that you would try and undo, I suppose? Leap in anyone.
I think that we've got time. I think people are probably going, oh, it's 2032. It wasn't that long ago that it was 2020, or that it was the 80s. So when you fast forward, I think that the time is 2 years ago or 5 years ago, to Richard's point. I think that's a big myth. I think there's a lot of good intent. I think we run the risk of not acting and just making, and consultation is critical. We do have to make some significant short-term decisions to get ourselves going. And I'm not seeing enough action, because we've known what the potential challenges and opportunities are for years. I think action, the myth is time.
I'd agree. Yeah. Given and not picking on Victoria's large major infrastructure projects, but how many of them are done in 4 years, 3 years, and that's the time frame we've got. And I first encountered this with, say, the Port of Hastings, and there was lots of promise around that. That's still mired in decision making, in planning, and I've had a history in EPBC, and so they've still got a good year or two of approvals processes to go before they even contemplate breaking ground. So that's, to me, that's an unachievable.
Yep.
When you look at that time frame. So what else is there? We talk about the Port of Geelong, we talk about other places. I can only see that time frame shrinking, and I agree. I don't see the urgency in a lot of decision makers. I don't know whether that's a political time cycle, 3-4 years or not, but it's going to become a crunch. And again, back to sustainability in terms of an industry. If these things are done in an ad hoc, last-minute fashion, it won't play out well in terms of the sustainability of the industry.
I think for me is misinformation, which is the myth is, offshore wind kills whales. You have posts that shows that. So what I want to point out is there's a lot of misinformation out there, and there's a void of trusted knowledge source. So this is why we really badly need universities to be that trusted knowledge source to kind of provide evidence-based information. Else, you will get a lot of misinformation out there and opposition because of that. Yep.
And I'd agree. Down where I live in Gippsland, it's amazing how many conversations I have with people around, particularly wind turbines, and you can see the ones off to the west of where I live, as well as the ones up in Tura. And frequently they're not turning, for instance, right? And the instant retort I get from people is, half the time they're not working. Why are we investing in this industry when half the towers don't spin? And sometimes they're not working at all. They're always breaking down. Yeah. And I've got to explain the whole energy cycle and the fact that actually they're not turning because they're surplus to requirements. And in fact, that's a good thing that they can shunt on and off in that sense. But that information's clearly not out there. And simple things like that, if you're trying to support an industry, are important, because if people think that they build these wind towers and they don't work, why do they want them offshore?
And look, just to add to that, thinking of transmission, there are so many things about EMFs and impact on farming and and also some of the other really interesting stuff that we come across. And maybe, Chao, there's a research project for some of our students to write an algorithm so that they can actually undo some of this, myths from that perspective. Because unfortunately, the world that we live in, there is just so much misinformation, and it's just how your algorithms work, right? So it just keeps on feeding that misinformation, and there are times where we have tried to really give them facts, but just wouldn't work. So I think it's there's an innovative idea that someone could come up with a solution. I think we'd be very keen to hear about that as well.
And I think just the other thing, Bill, is that it's not a new industry. It's new for Australia. And I think the more we can promote the fact that this has been happening for decades in other parts of the world, I think it's going to be really important to break that down. I think it's not new for us.
It's very good point. It is decades as well, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So, look, we might take some questions from the audience if we're okay with that for now. So, look, if anyone wants to pop their hand up, we've got a microphone that we can dash around with. Any questions?
Thanks, guys. Great discussion. Colin from InEight. I spent a bit of time working in offshore oil and gas in similar places, Barry Beach, and going to those kind of places. With the, I think now 11 feasibility leases that are remaining, is where it's at now. They're going to put jackets in Bass Strait that things are going to stand on, right? Fixed monopods or jackets or some fixed structure that's going to go to seabed. What did we learn from putting oil and gas platform jackets into the water since 1969 that could be shared amongst those groups? They're all doing separate EIS studies as far as I'm aware. What can we learn from what we've done in the past? and what might be the barriers to sharing that information?
From my perspective, because I attend both, I do a lot of conferences, I attend both sorts, there is a wealth of information and experience in the oil and gas industry that can directly be applicable. What I don't see is that industry pivoting, and I'm not sure it may be just that they're making too much money out of what they do at the moment. Why would they want to pivot? But clearly that is an opportunity, and the same kind of kit I see for repairs and maintenance underwater at 50 metres, for instance, in the oil and gas industry now, automated robots and whatnot. That stuff's already there. And yet when I go and speak to the wind industry guys, they're talking about almost coming up with their own bespoke sets of equipment. So, well, surely there's a lesson to be learned, or even just sharing. Those supply industries haven't yet switched, and we have one that represents us in Singapore, and I've spoken to them and said, are you ready to pivot to the offshore wind industry? And they haven't got a plan to do that. And yet that's a huge industry for them, particularly when you've got 140 structures alone for Star of the South. That's probably more structures than the oil and gas industry ever had out there. Yep, it's a logical one for me.
So in fact, this is where I would like to jump on. I think, yes, the knowledge can be transferred, but one of the big differences in terms of scale, where with oil and gas you have one big platform. So I'm approaching it from my research background. So I'm looking at foundation, be it monopiles or jacket. Now you have one big platform, and that means you can spend more money on your foundation or anchors. Now when you are talking about an offshore wind turbine, you have just pointed out 140 offshore wind turbine. So you need to come up with cost-effective solution in terms of foundation. And this is where, you need to try to optimize. And current practice, because of that carbonate crushable sediment, they're using a very expensive type of pile. So are all the developers going to use that for all 140 foundation? I'm not too sure about that. So there's definitely some room for optimization and improvement there. Yep.
Maybe I can add, I was in oil and gas and in background, I would do macro project as an offshore T&I package lead. So regarding soil, that's the biggest fear amongst every developer right now. Hence, we are doing site-specific studies. So before we even started the design, we did 6 deep boreholes and 15 shallow boreholes. And it's the same companies, which is the fortunate thing between oil and gas and offshore wind. So it's the likes of Fugro, who are world leaders and who are doing most of the stuff in Bass Strait, and Northwest Shelf, who did the soil boreholes for us, and they're doing for the last 4 months, they've been analyzing the soil samples at their Perth lab, based on which it's again the designers who have done the offshore oil and gas structures who are doing the design for us, likes of Worley, the likes of Kent. So there is a continuity. So there is. So I wish to differ in terms of.
Yeah, I'm being somewhat facetious, poking the bear
all
a
the
bit.
place. I would even go to the extent of saying, except the wind turbines up there, the remaining below the wind turbine, the balance of plant is 100% oil and gas supply chain. So that let's be assured that there won't be a gap in that. Yes.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Feel free to shout out. Yep.
Hi, I'm Jesper Norton. I work for Schneider Electric. I'm wondering whether you, and maybe it's a slightly different question, but I'm wondering what you're thinking about managing the political risk with the election coming up in November next year. And I suppose the other question that kind of ties into that is what opportunities you see to reduce costs over the next 15 years to kind of help with the community support, because we don't want to see electricity prices trend up for that entire period.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And look, I I don't want to go into any hypotheticals in terms of like, what happens at the next election and who comes in or who doesn't go in. I'll go by what is the current policy position, and that is like, offshore wind is a state policy, and the plan that we released a couple of weeks ago has designed the transition that factors offshore wind. Now, if things change, we will revise it or review it at that point in time, but at this stage we are absolutely focused towards that. Now, with regards to the impact to consumers, the cost, we did a lot of modelling as part of our Victorian transmission plan, and so I'll maybe take a minute to first explain for people who don't understand how energy bills work and the pricing works. So let's just say you pay $100 on your electricity bill. Of that $100, the majority of the proportions, say $50 is wholesale pricing. Then there is what we call the network pricing, which is the transmission pricing, then your distribution businesses, and then your retail margins. So that kind of makes up your $100 of a bill. Any investment that we are making at the moment in transmission infrastructure directly impacts the transmission charges. Now, what that gets offset by is wholesale prices. So, as coal units age, they become less reliable. We saw in 2022 what happened to the energy markets, where the wholesale prices just shot through the roof. So all the modelling that we have done suggests that, as we transition from aging coal to renewables, there will be downward pressures on the wholesale prices. Obviously, there will be upward pressures on the transmission prices as well. So that's a long-winded way of saying, yes, there are going to be some price increases, but overall, that will be impacted by downward pressures as well. Again, as engineers, you start off with a hypothesis and you always say, what's the counterfactual? What's the do-nothing scenario? And in that do-nothing scenario, when you look at post-2035, in addition to system blackouts and not enough supply to meet the demand, from that perspective, it's a very expensive future from that perspective. So we always look at what the counterfactual is, and then what are the options that we are looking at from that perspective. So, yeah, I think there were the two parts of your question, weren't there? Was there a third part of it, or?
More specifically around how you can reduce the cost of offshore wind over time.
Look, again, I think coming back to the observation that was made earlier is we are making assumptions in terms of the technologies that are available today, and that's what kind of factors in all the modelling. I'm sure in 5 years' time there will be, different ways of building, some of these are much maybe cheaper ways of building some of these offshore turbines. You look at, and we've got to just look at what happened to the onshore industry, and we look at what happened to the onshore solar, where they were 10 years ago to where they are now. It's like chalk and cheese from a pricing perspective. So it's really the costs of innovation, the opportunities from innovation that drives the cost down. The other opportunity that we have is economies of scale across the board. So I think that gives us a lot of opportunity to leverage off. But I'm always very careful when I say that, because I learned this the hard way 3 years ago when the Russian-Ukraine war occurred, and there was a 300% increase in supply chain costs. I had an expression of interest for a program, and then an invitation to tender, and the numbers were eye-watering based on the impact that war had on the supply chain. So, whenever we talk about costs, whenever we talk about prices, it's always going to be our best estimates at this point in time based on the assumptions that we are making now. And all the modeling that we have done gives me a lot of comfort that this is the right track on which we are on.
I think there is an opportunity for us to present ourselves to the global commercial market as a sector, and rather than, if it was 11 licenses granted, rather than 11 projects all going to the vendors for their own equipment, is there a way to amalgamate that for the economies of scale? And you could take Marinus Link and Copper String as two examples of transmission where they're going to market, they're going to potentially different vendors, they're buying as separate, a 380 and an 800 kilometre rather than a 1200 kilometre bulk. So and this is quite ambitious, whether the industry can present itself to the global vendor market to drive economies of scale. I think that's one of the challenges Australia has constantly faced, is that we've always presented ourselves to the market as megawatts, and most of the big vendors don't get out of bed until it's got a G in front of it. So if we can do a better job of that, I think that starts to help drive that also.
Awesome. We might have time for one last question, I think. Yeah, if there's anyone else that has a question. If not, I might come back to the panel and just leave you with one question here. I mean, considering the audience, if you're an engineer or a student, what's a good way to get involved in this now? I mean, this is, again, a transformational project for the state. What are the best avenues to get involved with this energy future for Victoria?
That's a good one. There are many ways. Event like this, conferences. I don't know, because I'm in this field, it doesn't, it's just natural to me.
Yes.
And just by a lot of online resources and events like this are very helpful.
Yep.
And obviously we are outreach activities by organization, and this is how we find out about all these events. Yep.
Awesome. All right.
I think it's about looking at all aspects. I think to Richard's point, it's not just the next 5 to 7 years. It's the fact that if you're a student, there is a career spanning 30 or 40 years of the life of an asset or an industry, and all those connecting parts. So I think it's about, and this is something that we often don't look enough about, is it's the total lifespan of whatever is being built and the future footprint that puts on it. And Richard, you've talked about that quite a bit. And so rather than just saying, there's a construction window of 10 or 12 years, but there's an operating window of 40, which is anything from drone engineers for operations and maintenance to civil construction engineers to project managers to scientists. The marine biology ecosystem will no doubt have so much more potentially to offer in Victoria than it has before. So I think it's just very eyes wide open kind of perspective.
Yeah, and I think if people equate this industry to the scale of, say, the coal-fired power station industry, where places like Latrobe Valley were set up for decades and decades, and the same in Newcastle and the same in Wollongong, that's the scale this is. So that opportunity should be there for decades of employment and decades of opportunities.
I'm just going to close off in terms of what the government is doing to really support this. And I was just looking at some of the couple of things that from the offshore wind in specific. So there's a renewable energy jobs task force that the government established, and that kind of looks at skills from like engineering levels to field level as well. And then there will also be a Victorian energy jobs plan that is planned to be released as well. I remember like 15 years ago when I joined the energy sector. I'm an electronics engineer. I'm not an electrical engineer by background, and there was that period when power systems engineering was almost like, why would you want to do it? It's just not attractive at all. And now it is the thing, right? And what excites me are, like, in 10 years' time, our grid will just be so different to what it is today. You talk about inertia, you talk about system strength, all these things we have to really, develop a lot of skills and capabilities to manage a system that ensures that, it is stable, and it's a completely different skill set to what was. So, I think, there are opportunities for universities to think about, their curriculum from an electrical engineering perspective and power systems engineering perspective. And I think, I encourage, students or people who really want to kind of build a career in this, reach out to us. I'm more than happy to kind of connect with you and, provide you any mentorship if you need on a personal level. But yeah, I think these forums are a great place to come as well.
I know time's up, but I just want to mention that we have indeed launched new subject to actually support offshore wind. So I'm teaching a subject called Offshore Wind Geotechnical Engineering.
That's a good one. Well, thank you. I think we're at time. So thank you very much to our panel for taking the time to come out here today. I think this is an amazing topic, and I've learnt a lot just by being involved in this about something that was a little bit hidden to me. I mean, the scale of offshore wind that's coming to Victoria and the contributing factors and infrastructure required to support it, and the collaboration that goes with that, I think is just an amazing topic that we could talk about for much longer as well. So thank you again, Andrew, Richard, Xiaowei and Deepak for taking the time today, and thank you everyone for taking the time to come and listen.
Thanks again, InEight, for the invitation and
worries.
moderating the panel.